The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Greetings from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and welcome to another 1615 webinar. I'm Matthew Ellison, president at 1615, and I also serve as a church missions coach. Today's webinar is the first in a three-part series that we've entitled Honor and Shame, Unlocking the Cultural Operating System of Those from the Non-Western World. Now, before we dive into the topic today, I want to let you know about a few upcoming events at 1615. We have a mission agency consultation that's right around the corner. Actually, there's still space left for one or two organizations that would like to participate. It's going to be held in Albuquerque, New Mexico, October 25 through 27. It's a consultation where we will spend time with church mobilizers in mission agencies, helping them to understand the local church better and helping them to think about how to develop more meaningful and effective partnerships with local churches. We've entitled it Engaging the Church, Pursuing the Nations. It's going to be very practical, and hopefully participants will leave with new ideas about how to partner with local churches. As I mentioned, this is first in a three-part series. So part 2 and part 3 will be following October 8th, November 1st. You can register for those at 1615.org. We certainly hope you'll participate, and we think after hearing today's topic, you'll definitely want to come back. Also want to mention the Mission Table. It's a ministry that we started 3 years ago. And in fact, Jeff Jackson, our presenter today, is one of our frequent table guests. We gather prominent missions thinkers to the table, and we tackle some of the most critical and controversial topics that are impacting the missions world today. Seasons 1 and 2 are archived, available for viewing right now, and season 3 is rolling out as we speak. Episode 1 is already out, and episode 2 will be available tomorrow. We hope you'll visit missiontable.org. We think you'll be stimulated and encouraged for the sake of world missions. So, God is bringing people from around the world to our local communities for His glory, their good, and His people's growth into Christ's likeness. This new reality means that understanding the differences between Western and non-Western cultures is essential for every follower of Christ, not just those that He calls to go to the ends of the earth. In today's session, we'll examine and compare the fundamental differences between Western and non-Western cultures using what Jeff calls a pyramid of culture model. This will provide the foundation for a clear definition and easy to understand explanation of the contrast between guilt-innocence operating systems of the West and the honor-shame operating systems from those in the non-Western world. Again, today's subject matter expert is Jeff Jackson. He serves as the Director of Church Relations and Missionary Care at Shepherd Staff Missions Facilitators. He's also the ministry's founder, and he happens to be a longtime friend of mine. I'm glad to know him. Shepherd Staff exists to serve and empower local churches in their efforts to send and care for their own members who've been called to serve as missionaries in countries outside the United States. In just a moment, I'm going to hand over the microphone and the controls to Jeff, but first, a few details. Your phones are muted to preserve sound quality, which means you can listen through computer speakers or you can call in on the telephone. As questions come to mind today, and we certainly hope they do, please type them in the question and answer panel located in the GoToWebinar task panel on the upper right-hand side of your screen. We'll be addressing your questions for the last 15 to 20 minutes of our time together, and this is your opportunity to enter into dialogue with Jeff. 52 people are registered for today's webinar. I want to remind everyone this webinar is also being recorded and will be available for viewing at 1615.org within the week. I'm going to hand it over to you now, Jeff. Thank you again for sharing with us today. The controls belong to you.
Thank you, Matt. And welcome to all of you that are tuning in by way of the webinar. My name is Jeff Jackson, and let me make sure get this on here. Hold on. There we go. So it's a blessing that you've taken the time to tune in today, and I count it a real privilege that you're interested in a subject that I think is really crucial for the church today and for individual believers. And as Matt talked about in the sort of introduction to what I'm going to share today, the reality of it is that God is bringing people into our country from around the world, and most of those come from other cultures. So with that in mind, let's see if I can move through these things and make this understandable. So whether they're refugees, whether they come in as international students, whether they come in as international business people, the reality is that God is sovereignly, bringing people from around the world into our neighborhoods. And if you've engaged at all in trying to build relationships with them and trying to touch them with the love and truth of Christ and the gospel, what you realize immediately is their cultures are very different than ours. So their cultural operating system, is in many senses the polar opposite of our cultural operating system. But the key thing, as point number 2 there on the slide shows, the key thing to understand is that their cultural operating systems are very similar to the cultural operating system of the people whose lives are described in the Bible. And what that means practically is that when we try to share God's truth with them, and if we're trying to anchor it in God's written word, much of what is written in our Bibles is easier for them to understand and relate to than it is for us. That's sort of the reality of the situation. So a lot of times as a pastor here in America and having been a missionary serving in a Southeast Asian country, I need to explain things about the text and about family dynamics and cultural dynamics as I unpack the truths of God's word. I need to do that at deep levels for Americans to get them to understand, what did this mean to the people at the time it took place? How would they have understood what's taking place? And what I found over the years in doing ministry, not only in Southeast Asia, but in a lot of other countries around the world, is that they don't need that level of explanation because their cultures are very similar to the cultures of the people that we're reading about in God's word. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to look at the fundamental differences between the two major cultural operating systems that are found within pretty much every person on the planet today. And what I want to do before I move on and give you some more specifics on that is I want you to think about a computer. Right now I'm sitting here looking at my Mac, and the Mac products operate with the iOS operating system. Some of you may be actually watching this webinar on a PC, and there are radical differences between the two operating systems. A Mac system everything is proprietary. Mac owns everything. They don't get input from other people. It's all in-house, and it is sort of a closed-off, isolated system that provides certain advantages that PCs don't. PCs, on the other hand, are more of a conglomeration of different companies that take the operating system, either Windows or whatever, and they're able to add to it. And so in the same way that they're both laptop computers, they both sort of do the same basic things. They're navigating by two different operating systems to make the computer work. And so that's kind of the way it is when you look at the different cultural operating systems within the world. So let me see if I can get to the foundation of this. When we're trying to understand what kind of cultural operating system does any group of people navigate by, what we want to do is ask individuals within that culture a basic question. And the basic question is, hey, as you understand it, the way you've been raised, what is the basic building block of society? And generally, you're going to get one of two answers. If they're from the Western world, you're going to get one answer. If they're from the non-Western world, you're going to get a different answer. So what is the basic building block of society? If that person answers the basic building block of society is the family, which is implying the extended family, not just the nuclear family, but the extended family, then and then they would move on and say, and the tribe, and so forth. Well, then we refer to that culture as a collectivistic culture. And the key concept is how the person views themselves. So somebody from a collectivistic culture, their view of themselves is, I am because we are, or because we are, I am. Now, if you ask somebody from, say, what we call a Western culture, what is the basic building block of society? If their answer is the individual, then we refer to that culture as an individualistic culture. And their view of self is basically, I think, I do, therefore I am. And so as you can see on the bottom slide there, we refer to individualistic cultures as Western cultures, and collectivistic cultures are referred to as non-Western cultures. And by the way, 90% of the people that live on this planet come from collectivistic or non-Western cultures. What's so interesting, as most of you know, is that the 10% of us who come from a Western culture, we're in the driver's seat in many ways, economically, politically, militarily, and so forth, and running the media, controlling the media that influences the world. Most of the media that influences the whole world is coming from a percentage of the population, 10%, that is very individualistic. And that individualistic understanding of the self permeates our music, it permeates our movies, especially our children's movies. And so it's just one of those interesting dilemmas that 10% of the population, in a sense, drives the bus that the other 90% of the world are on. And so that's the core concepts here of, basically, is it a collectivistic culture? If it is, it's not what we call non-Western. If it's individualistic, it's a Western culture. So with that sort of background in mind, what I want to do is I want to compare the foundational differences between Western and non-Western cultures. And normally I refer to this as the pyramid of culture, but because I'm a little bit technologically challenged, I couldn't put this into a pyramid type structure on my my keynote or my PowerPoint. And so they're more of like side-by-side lists here. But what I've found is I've traveled around the world, and in fact, I was in Southeast Asia the last 2 weeks, both in Thailand and the Philippines, and as I was doing training with both missionaries and with nationals from a number of different countries in Asia, and sort of unpacking these truths for them. The reality of it is that we need, as Westerners, we need to understand that sometimes we may need to reframe the way we do the gospel, the way we present the gospel. And I found the easiest way to do that is to do sort of a side-by-side comparison using the pyramid of culture, which is not a pyramid in this PowerPoint. So basically, Western culture is on the left in blue, non-Western is on the right. And the key concept to understand is the concept of esteem of the individual. In other words, esteem being the value, the significance, the importance of the individual. And of course, it ties in with their view of themselves, that Western view being, I think, I do, therefore I am. The non-Westerner, because we are, I am, or because I am, because we are. So as you look at this, if you can think of a pyramid starting at the top point, in Western culture, esteem is basically self-generated. Everything within Western individualistic culture is built towards the value of the individual, and it's built into our system that you have this responsibility to generate your own value, your own worth, your own significance. So in Western culture, the esteem of the individual is self-generated. Hence, we have terminology that's very common, very accepted by a lot of people today, the idea of self-esteem. And anytime anybody does something wrong, or their behavior is out of the ordinary, or they're destructive or whatever, generally what happens is the first inclination is, well, they don't have enough esteem. Their self-esteem is not high enough. So that's kind of the Western view. The non-Western view of esteem, and where esteem for the individual, what its source is, in the non-Western, basically esteem is ascribed or bestowed by the family. So whereas in Western culture, well, we value the child that's born, and we impart value and significance to them. We're teaching them from day one that it's their responsibility to find their own meaning, their own worth, their own value as they grow older. And all these mechanisms in our culture move them in that direction. Whereas in a non-Western culture, the idea of the individual's esteem, it's given to them by their family. It's ascribed to them. It's bestowed on them. And there's no expectation thrust upon them that they have to find their own worth, discover their own worth, find their own value. And so with that as sort of the top of the pyramid, everything that exists within that culture sort of flows, you might say, downward from that. So in Western culture, as you can see on the PowerPoint there, we basically, our primary identity is as individuals. When we're talking to one another in the West, we don't generally ask who our one another's parents are, how many brothers and sisters we have. Tell me about your grandparents. Tell me about the history of your family. We navigate with the idea of my individual identity as primary. I want to be known by everybody else primarily as an individual. And in fact, sometimes we get offended when people ask us about our family heritage. We don't want to be put into a group. So basically, we, in the West, Western culture, basically what we like is separating ourselves from the group. And that kind of helps us to, stroke our egos. It builds our esteem to be recognized separate from the group, not lumped into the group. Whereas in non-Western cultures, their primary identity is as a member of a group, primarily a member of their family. And as with many other aspects of culture, culture crosses over into language, language being the tool or one of the ways that, cultures express who they are and what they value. So in group identity cultures, such as, again, what we find of the peoples in the Bibles, you'll have things like the Apostle Peter was known as Simon Bar Jonah. And we all know, if we've studied our Bibles, that the word bar means son of. So when you would meet Peter, he would be known as Simon Bar Jonah, or the son of Jonah. There was blind Bartimaeus, the blind man that Jesus healed. He was known as the son of Timaeus. Barnabas, obviously the son of Abbas, or the son of encouragement. And so in non-Western cultures, when other people view you as an individual, they see you as part of your family. And one of the interesting things about how that carries into cultures today, I have a good friend who was a missionary for many years in Kenya, and over in that culture, among the specific group of people that they were working with, his wife was not referred to by her personal name. His wife was actually referred to as the mama of their son's name. So she was known by the title of Mama Jackson to all of the women that were in the tribe that they worked with, within the distinct group of people that they worked with. When I lived in Phoenix and I was working with refugees from around the world, many of them from the Middle East, the Arabic word Abu is the same kind of concept as bar found in your Bibles. So when you talk about a person named Abu Nidal, you're talking about that guy being the son of Nidal, or Abu Ghraib, or Abu Sayyaf. Or so when you hear the name, the word Abu, in a collectivistic culture, a non-Western culture, basically what you're hearing is that this individual person, although they have a personal name, they're viewed by other people as a member of a group. Their identity is found in the group. And so it's very important to understand that we as Americans, we as Westerners, that inclination we have to view ourselves as separate or distinct from the group, even our own families, puts us in a very different position than most of the rest of the world, which is like the cultures we read about in the Bible, where the individual's identity is not what's primary. Their identity as part of a group is what's primary. So if we don't understand that, it's very hard for us to be able to not only communicate truth, but even to relate to people. And so with that in mind, then, going back to the left column, individual identity is crucial in Western cultures, and therefore we are very independent. We value independence. Independence is a virtue. don't need anybody. Pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. You're the captain of your own destiny. Chart your own course. Be the person you've always wanted to be. Don't let anybody put restraints on you. So in Western culture, it's a virtue to be independent. In fact, our founding document for our country was called the Declaration of Independence, independence from, England. And that sort of mindset of independence is something that we highly value in Western culture. But in non-Western cultures, again, because they are collectivistic cultures, and your identity is primarily found as part of a group, dependence is actually a virtue. Interdependence is what you're looking for. So I remember when we served in Southeast Asia, and our daughter was 1 year old when we arrived. We as Americans, we want our kids to walk as soon as possible, to talk as soon as possible. We want to get them in their own bed, in their own room as soon as possible. And as our daughter was learning to walk at about 1 year old, and she was kind of stumbling, our way of helping her walk was to let her fall and then tell her to get up and try it again. But when our neighbors saw this, who were from a collectivistic culture, they were appalled that we didn't walk around behind her, and when she started to wobble and started to fall, that we didn't hold her up so she didn't fall. And so there were all of these glaring differences as we raised our kids with Western values, valuing their individual identity, valuing their independence, in the midst of a people who they value dependence. Everything is built on needing one another and interdependence, and it makes sense. If your identity is found in a group, and the cohesion of the group and relationships at a deep level are found in dependence and interdependence, then it makes sense that those things would be virtues. Dependence and interdependence are virtues. Independence would be a weakness because it sets you apart from the group. And so you have kind of, again, polar opposites. Now, one of the things that I found over the years that's interesting, and there's a guy who wrote about this, a guy named Stan Nussbaum. He's got a great book on Proverbs, understanding different cultures using Proverbs, and particularly one on he's got on American culture viewed through our Proverbs. One of the key points that he makes is that in non-Western cultures, and I'm just going to use the Japanese example versus an American proverb, listen to these two proverbs and tell me what they sort of declare about the differences between these two cultures. The Japanese proverb is, the nail that sticks up will be pounded down. And that proverb is in almost all collectivistic cultures, using different forms. But the Japanese version of it is, the nail that sticks up will be pounded down. The American proverb is, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. Now stop and think about that. Those are two polar opposite views of independence, of being part of the group. In Western culture, set yourself apart from the group, draw attention to yourself. What you want is what matters, and so separate yourself from the group, get the attention you want, and you'll ultimately obtain your goal. Versus, hey, if you separate yourself from the group from which your identity is found, you are the nail that sticks up. The group is going to pound you down and show you what your real source of identity is. And it's not in your own individualism, your own worth, your own value. It's the value you have as part of a group. So you see, those are polar opposites. And again, they make sense if you understand that foundational concept of esteem in Western culture is self-generated. Esteem in non-Western cultures is ascribed or bestowed. So what then follows logically from this in Western culture, which is individual identity is everything, and independence is absolutely one of the greatest virtues, is we then value tasks. We are a task-oriented group of people. In fact, some people refer to the Western view of humanity as, we view other people as human doings, not human beings. And whereas in non-Western cultures, who are group identity based, who value dependence and interdependence, they're very relational. They're relationship oriented. They see people as human beings We see them as human doings. And so in Western culture, accomplishing the task is what matters. It gives you a good feeling about yourself when you accomplish the task. It is a way of showing help and blessing to other people by accomplishing tasks. Sometimes we make the task such a high priority that we forget we're trying to do the task for somebody else. The task becomes more important than the people. So these foundational differences are, what makes us as Westerners, as Americans, radically different. Now, one of the interesting things that I've found based on my own experience and substantiated, I think, by reality, I went from a kid growing up in Southern California, which is sort of the pinnacle of Western culture in the 70s. I grew up, and when I graduated high school, I made the crazy decision to join the military. And I went into the U.S. Army a month after I graduated, and I had this rude awakening as I went into basic training, where they stripped away everything I valued as a Westerner, as a Californian, as a young man growing up in America. And what I've discovered over the years, and those of you that are listening that served in the military, or those of you that know people who have served in the military, you will discover, as you think about it, that the military, every branch has what we refer to as basic training. And the purpose of basic training is to crush Western culture out of the recruits, because you can't operate a military effectively using Western cultural values of, self-esteem, of individual identity, of independence, of the task being more important than the people. In some ways that's true, but basically, basic training exists to crush Western cultural values and to instill in the people a lot of what we now know as non-Western cultural values, where your primary identity is part of your unit, where dependence and interdependence are crucial to accomplish the mission. And when you start unpacking the differences, and we're going to get into honor and shame here in just a minute, it's radical. So in Western culture, we highly value time. In non-Western culture, they highly value an event, because the event and the people gathered at the event are what really matters. It doesn't really matter what time it starts or what time it ends. So when you're navigating in most of the rest of the world, if you're going to a wedding or a graduation ceremony or whatever, there'll be times posted, but the event won't start on time and it won't end on time, because the event is what matters, and there's certain people that have certain status. The event can't get started until the people of certain honor and status arrive. And so one of the differences, again, between Western and non-Western culture is that we highly value time. There's a great little sort of cliche that's passed around. Some of you have probably heard it, where there's a gentleman from a country in Africa comes to America, and he says, I don't understand what's happening. He said, in my country, nobody has a watch, but everybody has time. And he said, but here in your country, everybody has a watch, but nobody has time. So when the individual is pursuing, self-value, self-worth, pursuing their own individual identity and accomplishing tasks helps them to feel better about themselves, then time becomes a commodity that's highly valued and has to be managed. And so when we attend an event, maybe an ongoing event that happens every week, like a home Bible study or whatever, one of the things that we'll consider before we go back next week is, well, it didn't start on time and we didn't get home until this time. Let's not go back this week because it didn't start on time or end on time. Whereas somebody from a non-Western culture, they don't really care about what time it starts or what time it ends. It's the event itself and the deepening of relationships and participating in this communal experience that really matters to them. Next, relationships in Western culture are many times, obviously not always, a means to an end. I'll have a relationship with you. We'll be friends and so forth until our friendship no longer furthers my personal goals. Once my personal goals, where our continuing to spend time together doesn't further my personal goals, well, I'll see you later and maybe talk to you later. So relationships in Western cultures are not always, but generally a means to an end. And whereas in non-Western cultures, relationships are an end in themselves. And finally, on this subject, as far as the pyramid of culture, in our Western culture, we are very youth focused. Youth is admired, youth are respected. And in our culture, the older you get, in a sense, the least significance you have. The older you get, the more you're sort of viewed as somebody who's out of touch with what's happening today. You're sort of viewed as a dinosaur and so forth. And so youth is what's admired. Youth is what's respected. A lot of churches are actually moving in this direction constantly in America, saying, look, we need to raise up younger people. We're losing the younger generation, and certainly there's some truth to that. But the reality of it is that, we don't, as a culture, value people the older they get. Whereas in non-Western cultures, the older you are, the more you're admired, the more you're respected, the more value, the more status you have. You're sort of viewed as the sage, as the wise one. When younger people in non-Western cultures have issues going on in life and they're trying to figure out, how did I respond? How should I respond? What should I do in this certain circumstance or situation? They'll find somebody who's older. And so age in non-Western cultures, gray hair is not a door closer. In fact, as I've gotten old and gray, I'm 59 now. I got quite a bit of gray around the sides of my hair. And so now when I travel, especially to Asian countries or other, navigate within cultures like the Middle East, my gray hair and my age actually, in a sense, raises the level of honor, the status that I have, the respect that's given to me. So these are sort of foundational differences between Western and non-Western cultures. And I would just challenge you, as you look at these two columns, to think about, which of the columns matches with what we see of the people in the Bible and the way they navigate life. And then also, which of the two columns, in a sense, lines up with what we know as kingdom culture, the culture of God's kingdom. When you surrender to God and you surrender your life to be a follower of Jesus, you come as an individual, but immediately you have an identity as a member of the body of Christ. Your very standing before God is dependent on Jesus, not your own good works. Yes, we need to do tasks, but it's the relationships that matter in the kingdom of God. And so a lot of times when you kind of look at these two different pyramids or these two different lists, a lot of what the Bible declares are crucial components of kingdom culture, non-Western cultures are sort of already navigating with those values, of course, without the spiritual component because they're not right with God. But once people step into a relationship with God, the kingdom of God and the culture of God's kingdom can sometimes flow outward and have greater impact within non-Western cultures than it does within Western cultures. So besides these columns here, let me move on to the thing that this seminar is actually all about, but I really wanted to take the time to lay this foundation for the fundamentals for the differences is Western culture then, because of all of the things that I just talked about in the left-hand column in the blue, we are an innocence and guilt-based culture. And non-Western cultures are honor and shame-based. Now, innocence and guilt-based cultures are basically cultures that where the individual is primary. And the idea is that in Western cultures, I, as an individual, am constantly comparing myself to some standard, some objective rule, and how am I in comparison to that standard? Am I acting in a way that is keeping me in a condition of innocence, or have I violated it, and am I in a condition of guilt? And we're going to unpack honor and shame more in just a minute, but the thing that I want you to understand, and I use this analogy because it usually it helps people to really get a handle on it. Without even thinking, most Westerners, most Americans understand the concept of innocence and the concept of guilt. What we understand without thinking about it is that guilt is both objective and subjective. And what I mean by that is, guilt is a condition and it's also a feeling. It's objectively a condition and it's subjectively a feeling. And we all know that, even though we don't think about it. So when you drive at some point today, if the speed limit is 35 and you're driving 45, you're in an objective condition of guilt of violating the speed laws. But you don't feel it, right? You don't feel guilty violating the speed laws until you see a cop at the next corner, or you look in your rearview mirror and you see a police car a couple cars back. Now your subjective feeling matches your objective condition, and that moves you to do what? Slow down so you don't get a ticket. But you all understand that you were in a condition of guilt even though you weren't feeling it. So we understand, again, without thinking, that you can be in a condition of guilt but not feel guilty. The flip side, you can actually feel guilty about something, but you can't figure out, am I actually guilty of violating something? Why do I feel guilty? I'm not in some condition of guilt that I'm aware of, but I still feel guilty. And what we do as Westerners is we basically have relegated shame completely to the subjective realm. And part of what I want to unpack for you during the rest of the seminar today and over the next couple of weeks, the next couple of seminars, is the idea biblically that shame is not just the subjective feeling, that shame is in the same category as guilt. It is both objective and subjective. What we do is we relegate the concept of shame to this personal feeling bad about myself, and so we leave it in the realm of feelings, and certainly there is that component to shame. Shame is a feeling, it's subjective, but biblically shame is also objective. It's not just a feeling, it's also a condition. So in non-Western cultures, their operating system is honor and shame based. So again, our operating system, the core operating system of Western culture, based on all of what I just shared with you, we are an innocence and guilt-based operating system. The individual navigates with an innocent and guilt-based sort of a navigational system, you might say GPS. And the non-Western people, they navigate with an honor and shame-based, because honor and shame are inherently group-oriented. Honor and shame are the natural byproducts of an identity as part of a group. And we're going to sort of define those terms here in just a minute. Keep in mind that non-Western cultures, though, they naturally understand that shame is both objective and subjective. We don't. And they generally leave guilt strictly in the subjective realm. Because they're navigating, again, by a different compass than we are. So those are some sort of overview differences about the two. Let's go on and look specifically at, let's see, get this thing going to the next one. Where to go? Okay, so, whoop. Hold on, stay with me here. I don't know why yeah. So honor in a collectivistic culture. What is honor? I've thrown that term around. That's basically what the seminar title is about. What is honor in a collectivistic culture? Well, basically, in a collectivistic culture, honor is the worth, the value, the prestige, or the reputation of a person, crucial phrase, in the eyes of those that are significant to them. It's a person's public worth or esteem, and a crucial concept to understand about honor in a collectivistic culture is the individual's honor in the eyes of the group that matters to them and in the eyes of other people. A person's honor maintains the bonds they have with the community from which their identity is drawn. Okay, so that's very important. Again, going back to the U.S. military, which I found is very helpful for helping Americans understand this. When a member of a specific unit within the military does something heroic, courageous, acts selflessly, and so forth, he already has a certain amount of honor because he's part of the unit, and his maintaining his own personal honor maintains the honor of the group. And if his honor individually increases, it increases the honor of the group, and it actually can increase the bonds that he has with the community from which his identity is drawn. Okay, we'll unpack that more a little bit as we go along. So that's what honor is in a collectivistic culture. And how is honor obtained? In an honor and shame-based culture, there's two ways that you can obtain honor. One is, honor can be ascribed to you. It's, in other words, it's granted based on the group's existing honor. So I want to go back again to the military. When, especially a U.S. Marine, and I live in the San Diego area, so we got lots of Marines around here. We have the Marine Corps Recruit Depot. When a new person goes into the Marines and they go into basic training, boot camp, what they call it, they don't get the title of Marine until they're almost done with boot camp. At that point, when they've done the things required by them, then the group bestows upon them the title of Marine. And now they have the honor ascribed to them of all the other Marines that have ever gone before them. So the idea is that in an honor and shame-based culture, one source of honor is ascribed. It's the group has a certain status of honor. You're now part of that group, and therefore the group's honor is ascribed onto you. Also, in an honor and shame-based culture, you can achieve honor. Achieved honor is earned by honor-worthy, usually self-denying actions done for the good of others and on behalf of the group. So honor can be ascribed or honor can be achieved. And generally speaking, in honor and shame-based cultures, the way to achieve honor is not by pursuing self-fulfillment. The way to achieve honor is by doing those things that require self-denial, self-sacrifice for the good of the group, for the honor of the group. Now, here's the thing that's crucial to understand about honor and shame-based cultures, and again, something that's very hard for us as Westerners to understand. In an honor and shame-based culture, when an act or a person does that which can achieve them honor, because it's inherently public, achieved honor has to be bestowed or granted by the group. It can't be self-ascribed. In other words, in an honor and shame-based culture, if I do something that is heroic and I've achieved a certain level of honor, I cannot claim that honor. I can't self-ascribe honor. In fact, if I self-ascribe honor to myself, that's shameful. And not only does it bring shame to me to self-ascribe honor, it actually brings shame to the group from which my honor is drawn. So those are important truths to keep in mind. Now let's look at shame. Shame is basically the opposite of honor. It's the loss of regard, of value, or worth in the eyes of the group from which your identity is found. It's basically a negative public rating that also decreases the honor of your group. And shame damages the social bonds you have with the community your identity is drawn from. So again, if your identity is found as part of a group, and that group has a certain level of honor, and you act in accordance with the honor of the group or do things that increase the honor of the group, you'll have an increased amount of honor bestowed upon you. But the flip side is, if you act shamefully, if you do things that lower your own honor in the eyes of others, you not only are shaming yourself, but you're also lowering the honor of the group from which your identity is drawn. The classic example of this that kind of resonates with most Americans is after the Boston bombing, the uncle of Sarna brothers, he's interviewed by CNN, and basically he says, that they had brought shame to the Sarna family by the way that they've acted by doing the bombing. And then he takes a step even back further from that and says, in fact, he says they brought shame and dishonor on the whole Chechnyan people. Now the world has a lesser regard for the Chechenian people because of the actions of these two, whereas we as Americans would say, hey, they were two Americans, they made their individual choices. What they've done doesn't reflect on us as a group. If you're coming from a collectivistic culture, what the individuals do, they do reflect on the group. It lowers the honor or the status of the group. So shame damages the social bonds you have within the community your identity is derived from, primarily because shame lowers not just the honor of the individual, but the group from which his identity is drawn. Face is a crucial part of that. It's a metaphor for interpersonal social honor. Shame causes a loss of face. You're now viewed by the group as ugly and less than honorable, or viewed by others. And the group's honor is diminished when you lose face. Social cohesion is negatively impacted. And the key thing to understand here, and we'll unpack this more next week biblically, is the idea that in a collectivistic culture that's honor and shame based, it's everyone's responsibility to save other people's face of the individual. If you do something inadvertently that's going to be shameful or cause you to lose face, and I'm part of the group that your identity is drawn from, I have a responsibility to save other people's face. And so in honor and shame-based cultures, and you'll see this biblically, as I said, next week, in honor and shame-based cultures, face is sort of used as a commodity that can be used to influence the behavior of others. So this is a lot of stuff to cover in a short amount of time. And so I think what I'll do, because I'm right at the time we're supposed to stop for this session, here's some recommended resources. You can check out honorshame.com or jacksonwood.com. Here's some classic books. And again, these are all referred to on the honorshame.com website, but the 3D Gospel, or Ministering Honor and Shame Cultures by Jason Georges, the Global Gospel by Werner Mischke, who actually shared on this subject at a previous 1615 webinar. And there's a great book, very thorough, very academic, by David De Silva on honor, patronage, and kinship. And so with that, again, this subject is so large that we dedicated 3 webinars to it. Let me just close by challenging you to think about, again, the differences between Western and non-Western cultures. And one of the things that you're going to find is that what we navigate with as virtuous and of great value to us as Westerners is independence. And we are a guilt and innocence-based culture, whereas most of the rest of the world, because they are group-oriented, are honor and shame-based cultures. So with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Matt.
Jeff, thank you so much. What wonderful insights, really encouraging to learn about these things. So I want to remind everyone, this is your opportunity to enter into the conversation with Jeff. The question and answer panel is located on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you would like to address him, I will filter those questions to Jeff. I have one here, Jeff, to begin with. It seems that this would affect how money is viewed and handled. Can you please talk about that?
Oh, that's a great question. Absolutely. See, one of the things that separates us is when we, in an individualistic culture, when we earn money, we earn it as an individual. We look at it as something that we've earned, and then we have control or possession of it and can use it for whatever purposes we desire. In a collectivistic culture, the individual that earns money will sort of view his money as belonging to the group. So that, yes, I've earned the money, but because my identity and my day-to-day living and the things that I need up to this point in time where I've now been able to earn the money, because I've been dependent on the group, when I earn money, the money is not just my own and under my control. My first thought and first responsibility is, how can the money that I've earned, which is the byproduct of the group where I draw my identity from, how can this money that I've earned be used for the good of the group? And that's an interesting dilemma, because that was one of the challenges in the refugee ministry that I did with refugees many years ago in Phoenix, and with other refugees, and not just refugees, but people that come from other countries that are developing nations, and now they earn money here in America, and they're making their wages, and they're sending a large portion of their money back to their home country. And so that's a hard transition for them to make. And maybe it's a transition that maybe they don't need to make at the same level we would as Westerners. But you picked up on a very crucial point that I think a lot of times we as Westerners, and certainly missionaries working in non-Western cultures, our view of money is our Westernized, individualistic, self-achieved perspective on it versus, hey, no, I've earned the money, yeah, but I can only earn it because I've been shaped and molded into who I am. And this money, although I've earned it, belongs to the group. And I may have some say over it, but basically my first thought is, how can the group benefit from what I've earned, rather than how can I benefit from what I've earned?
Yeah, that's really interesting. It is a fascinating question. A missionary that I know working in Africa, there was theft going on in the village that he was in. Possessions were being taken. And when he learned the role of money in a non-Western mindset, that they weren't stealing, they were trying to benefit the collective, if you will, as you described. And so, what he viewed as theft, they viewed as a virtue. I think it's really important to understand those things. Jeff, can you tease that out a little bit more? I mean, theft is obviously wrong. So how would you address that in a non-Western setting?
Well, it's one of the things that I've been really thankful for, especially Jason George's understanding in a lot of these areas, is the idea that, what is right and wrong. When we make the statement theft is obviously wrong, well, obviously based on what? And so what if right and wrong was not based on this standard, these rules being violated, but what if right and wrong was determined by what's good for the group, what's good for relationships? And so, in fact, as I've thought that through, the whole idea of the Ten Commandments, we tend to look at the Ten Commandments as this external subjective rules that God gave, to his people, but those are expressions of God's character. And so to violate, one of the commandments is not just to break some external objective standard, it's to basically jab a knife in the heart of the God whose character is expressed in that commandment, and you personalize it and relationalize it. So I think even the idea of theft is always wrong, but how do we define what is wrong, and is theft wrong in the sense of, it's wrong. It was my possession, but what if we view whatever we possess as part of the group's? Now, my individual possession of it isn't the barometer of whether it being taken is wrong. Is it being taken from the group? And so I'm not trying to dodge the answer. It's just that that's a big subject. And what can we want to make it black and white and right and wrong. And that if you're navigating in a highly relational culture, it's not the law, the standard written laws that motivate decision making. It's the relational laws, and relational laws are different than external objective subjective laws.
Yeah, this is very nuanced. It takes a lot of cultural intelligence to be sensitive in these areas. So Philip asks, Jeff, could you explain further what you mean by guilt being subjective in a non-Western culture?
Yeah, okay, because it kind of ties in with my answer just a minute ago. Like in my sharing with people in Asia and Middle Eastern, and your typical presentation of the gospel, the idea of showing them that they're guilty before God, they violated God's law. Again, that's they understand that they're in a guilty position before God, but to them it's just a feeling. It's a subjective feeling that doesn't have necessarily consequences. What they navigate by is shame. I've acted in a way that's defiled God's name. It's shamed God. And so So in the same way that for us as Westerners, we leave shame in the subjective realm, they leave shame in or guilt in the subjective realm. And what really matters to them is not how they compare to a law. They know they're violating the law, but what really matters is the relationship. And so, so you'll hear this phrase when you work in a lot of spend a lot of time in developing nations. Is that country got the rule of law? And what we mean by the rule of law is that's a country, or that's a cultural group of people that recognizes law sits above any individuals, and law rules. But in most other countries, it's not laws that rule, it's cultural habits. So even though the written law of the land is that, cutting down trees is wrong because you're deforesting the forest, that's the law of the land. If I need to cut down trees to feed my family or to help other neighbors that are part of my community, now there's a conflict between the law of the land and the cultural principles that I navigate by. I'm going to obey the cultural principles, which puts me in violation of the law. So yeah, I feel guilty about it, but where my day-to-day life is I'm navigating by this honor and shame-based GPS system rather than rule of law-based system. Again, we're almost out of time. These are big subjects.
Yes.
That's a great question, and yeah.
I'm going to give you one more, Jeff, and then we will wrap it up. I'm going to let you do a closing statement after that. But Mark asks, do you see the U.S. as becoming more shame-based in the increasingly common protests we see around the country? Shame on you, he says, is a common cry. Do you feel that there's more shame-based culture entering into the United States? And if so, what are the differences between U.S. shame orientation and the rest of the world?
Yeah. Okay. So the simplest answer to that is honor and shame and guilt and innocence are hardwired into us by God. So sin has corrupted both systems, honor and shame based and guilt and innocence based. American culture, you can't get away from having an honor and shame based awareness because it's hardwired into us, but it's kind of been put aside. Now what's happening is the way our culture is going, there is more of an honor and shame based awareness, but it's the unique westernized version of individuals. So it's my individual shame, my this, I'm going to try to shame you into accepting the moral behavior that all the rest of us accept. Now you're a dinosaur, you're not keeping up with the modern times. So there is a shame component in our culture that's now being called upon in ways it hasn't in years. But it's the unique individualized version of shame. It's not the group-based shame that you find throughout most of the rest of the world. Shame will always show itself, but it's been twisted by sin, and it will be influenced by whether you come from an individualistic culture or a collectivistic culture. So in fact, shame is one of the tools that's being used now to propagate American cultural values of hyper-individualism and self-identity regardless of the cost. And if you don't, as an individual, agree with somebody's self-expression, whatever they express themselves to be, if you don't agree with that, well, then you're shameful. But it's an individual-based shame. So even our individualistic culture has influenced the way we understand shame versus somebody from a collectivistic culture. Their understanding of shame is viewed through a collective lens, a group identity first and foremost.
Yeah, that's good. So obviously these concepts are very important for how we share the gospel with non-Westerners, whether those non-Westerners are here through immigration or refugees, or even our efforts to reach non-Western peoples around the world, Jeff. So let us know what's coming in the next two installments before we wrap it up here.
Yeah, so the next installment, I'm going to give you some principles for looking at texts that you're very familiar with from God's Word, but to sort of look at them or frame them within this honor and shame based milieu that I've been talking about here. So we'll look at specific texts in the next in our next session, and then in the third session I'll walk you through how to actually start sharing the gospel from an honor and shame-based frame rather than that guilt and innocence-based frame.
It's great. So folks, you'll definitely want to tune in, because that's really the heartbeat of these topics, is how do we effectively share the gospel with others that do not have our Western mindset. So Jeff, thank you so much for sharing today. I want to thank everyone for participating, being a part of this very important conversation. Let me remind you that this webinar has been recorded. It will be available for viewing within about a week. So Jeff, thank you again for sharing with us today. I'm Matthew Ellison for 1615. Thanks again for listening.